Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome, everyone. My apologies that we're beginning 8 minutes late. I think that the Honorable Senator is always mobbed by his admirers everywhere he goes, and I'm sure he's very sorry that we were delayed. I get told that I speak too much when I'm trying to moderate, but they still keep asking me to moderate, so I don't know what's happening. Max, this is a brilliant book. Anyone in the room had a chance to read it yet? No, you have, of course. Musadik, of course, Dr. Malik, Senator Musadik Malik, is actually a really interesting and important character in the book. The book is great, but when I first saw the title, Max, to be honest with you, I was a little bit irritated. And then I was irritated by the fact that this session is sponsored by the European Union. I just find the positions that have been taken by people like Ursula von der Leyen to be completely indefensible. And the outpouring of support, which is perfectly legitimate, I suppose, at some level, or maybe at every level for Ukraine, isn't matched by the way that, for example, Pakistanis on boats on the coast of Greece are treated, or the way that the people of Palestine are being murdered in what is and what can only be described as a genocide. I think I want you to speak at length about the book, but I want you to start by explaining to young Pakistanis who are clearly invested in the world that you're a part of and the world that I get to be a part of occasionally, the mainstream global discourse, in particular the one led by the West, seems to want us to care about Ukraine, but in response and in return doesn't seem to have even, really, in terms of the state behavior of countries like the United States and many members of the European Union, the behavior on Palestine, the treatment of foreigners trying to get into the European Union, those things leave a really bad taste. And it makes us wonder, I think, why should we care about what Putin is doing to Ukraine?
Well, thank you all so much for joining us. I will say thank you to the European Union for sponsoring my ability to be here. But I am an American, German, British, half Catholic, half Jew. This obviously is something that speaks to an audience like myself and the audiences that I speak to in those places. And my family originally descends from the Russian-Ukrainian borderlands. I certainly, agree that tragedy in Gaza, the ongoing, what I certainly would agree is a genocide there and an attempt to ethnically cleanse that entire population, is a tragedy and something that doesn't get the attention that it deserves, nor does the migrant crisis. And the West really is united and supported behind Ukraine in a way that it is largely absent, or in some cases driving the problems in those other crises and conflicts. And that is certainly something that I very much see as a tragedy. So, my book certainly aims to speak to those audiences as well, but hopefully also add some insight to an audience such as the one here about why this conflict is something so important and something that directly affects Pakistanis and will continue to do so, and as well as some of my views about the international order as it does exist. I'll start off by saying the conflict really began right in 2013. This war has been going on for 11 years now. And the use of economic tools actually began on the Russian side, where Ukraine, right next to Russia, they do have a broad and deep shared history. I spent a lot of time in eastern Ukraine. I speak Russian. I don't speak Ukrainian, and that's always been good enough to get by. But Putin really used the conflict not only as a tool to try to keep Ukraine within his own sphere of influence, two neighboring countries that used to be one, disagreeing over their political futures is, I think, something that is certainly, not alien to audiences in this region either. But It was also in late 2013 that Putin began to use economic tools that I saw as him really weaponizing this conflict as not only a tool against Ukraine, but also against the Western-led international economic order. And so,
Max, I'm sorry. I'm
yeah,
going to do a lot of this
sure,
to
sure.
both of you. Could you go back a bit further back? Because a lot of us we're not familiar with the details of the history, but maybe at least back to 2004 and the politics within
Sure.
Ukraine that kind of was
Sure.
being influenced by Putin and
So
his allies.
Ukraine has had two revolutions in the last 20 years, back in 2004 and 2013, where the real split in the country was over its direction in terms of would it look back towards Moscow, its old partner in the Soviet Union and Russian Empire before that, or would it look to a more Western future integrating with the European Union? In 2013 was meant to be the culmination of a process that had begun with the first revolution in 2004 of seeking integration into the economic structures of the European Union. Putin then already had intervened after elections then, had heavily supported a candidate seen as very pro-Russian and deeply, deeply corrupt, named Viktor Yanukovych. When he finally fell from power in 2014, not only was his incredibly ostentatious mansion discovered, but it was literally had rooms filled with gold bars. He wasn't even really trying to hide it. And so, it started off very much as a conflict over Ukraine's economic position, cultural position. Putin famously wrote this article about the so-called historical unity of Russian and Ukrainian peoples to put these cultural, societal, and political arguments forward. But where my book really begins off is there at the end of 2013 and beginning of 2014, as Putin used this to try to target the Western-led international economic order. And when I say that, going back to my speech at the intro and the injustices that we see in the West's position with regards to the conflict in Gaza, or with regards to the migrant crisis, the conflict in Yemen, or complete, lack of attention to many others in Africa and elsewhere as well. I don't believe there's such a thing as a rules-based rules-based order, what the West is so, fond of talking about. But I do believe there is an international economic order, and we'll speak a little bit later about both the pros and cons of that. But what Putin really, beginning in around 2004, 2005, the same time that these unrest happened in Ukraine, had started speaking about was he started speaking very vociferously and angrily about the US dollar and its dominant role in the world. The US dollar is a very unique currency in that it's used in 60% of global transactions, 60% of countries' sovereign reserves are in it. It makes up the majority of what are called the special drawing rights of the IMF. That's the money that a country like Pakistan gets when it borrows from the International Monetary Fund. And this gives the US certain, not only economic privileges, in that it can borrow money much more easily than a country like Pakistan or Ukraine can, but also gives it the ability to enforce its view of the world on a lot of places, right? So we see that with sanctions in particular.
Because this was, as I mentioned to you, one of my favorite paragraphs that I've read anywhere. I just wanted to repeat this for the audience's benefit. I think it's a powerful paragraph that a lot of Pakistanis will relate to. Max writes, the difference between Russia and the United States is that the West has been able to take action over Russia's violations, whereas the West is impervious to whatever Russia could do. And then he says, there is no rules-based international order. I'm repeating this, he just said it, but this really comes home in a big way. There is no rules-based international order, but there is an international economic order, and understanding the West's privileged position in it is key to understanding what would come to be at stake in the economic war. Max, you mentioned how the U.S. is able to impose its will. Yeah. Talk a little bit about, because you mentioned some of the international institutions that, so maybe talk also.
So, I use the IMF and the World Bank as examples there. The IMF, of course, is a lender to Pakistan in the present moment. The World Bank has also sponsored a lot of projects here. These are nominally United Nations institutions, right? But both of them are based in Washington, D.C., not in New York or Geneva or Vienna, where the other UN institutions are. The U.S. has an effective veto over their management and who the senior official is in charge. And it's not only to that extent that it applies it, but look at the impact of U.S. sanctions. If an individual on the U.S. sanctions list, whether that be over terrorism or over Russia's actions, what the U.S. views as terrorism, goes to a Pakistani bank, that Pakistani bank is not going to deal with them because their access to U.S. dollars is far more important than whatever business, no matter how wealthy that individual may be able to bring. Whereas if an individual is put on Russia's sanctions list, it has frankly no impact whatsoever, except for that maybe they can't go travel to Russia anymore. And the Russians do create their own sanctions list, but no bank or financial institution internationally pays any attention or mind to them.
Again, the Magnitsky Act, I
Sure.
think, is an important part of that sort of story.
Yeah, so the Magnitsky Act was a series of sanctions passed in 2012 in the United States that targeted Russian individuals who were involved with expropriating assets from a company called Hermitage Capital Management, run by Bill Browder, who's since become a leading advocate for sanctions, made lots and lots of money in Russia in the 90s, early 2000s, was even a booster of Putin's as he went after his opponents in Putin's first years in power, defended him in those moves. And, for me, it was really a tragic misunderstanding in that the Russians saw this as the U.S. using its power in a manner that essentially exploited its advantage over the international institutions. Whereas in Washington, this really happened as a result of lobbying and sort of backroom politics. And the Obama administration actually had opposed it at the time. But Congress passed it, and the Obama administration didn't see it as worth using its political capital to veto that bill. That would have caused them a much larger crisis. And of course, it had come, just as Barack Obama was running against Mitt Romney for the president, where Romney had said Russia is still the foremost threat to the United States, and Obama laughed at him in a televised interview over this comment. So, the Magnitsky Act really, I think, accelerated Russia's efforts in 2013 and 2014, which involved messing with Ukraine's government borrowing structures. This is a very complex legalistic issue involving how countries borrow on international markets, but just as Ukraine does, Pakistan also borrows in something called Eurobonds, which are simply bonds denominated in a foreign currency, usually dollars, sometimes euros. They're called euro bonds because the market was invented in Europe in the 1960s and 70s. But Russia changed the words in the contract of one of them, got the Ukrainians to agree to change the words that effectively gave it the ability to bankrupt Ukraine at any point if it wanted to, and to really mess with the international structure for how countries lend to other countries in distress. So, this is an international structure that every country anywhere in the world benefits from in terms of going to the IMF. And what they did was they said, we essentially have a veto over the IMF and its ability to lend to Ukraine. This is just as if India had at one point many years ago lent Pakistan some money and then went and said, this is, you can no longer borrow any money from anyone. And getting to that difference between the international economic order and the international rules-based order, the IMF literally changed its rules to help Ukraine and to get out from this conflict with Russia over it. And the IMF, I've asked them many times, they will all say, no, we were considering this rule change, very technical issue, had nothing to do with the geopolitics of it. But I don't believe them for a second, and I think the evidence that that wasn't exactly true came in the fact that the IMF made its announcement only in 2 languages, rather than in all the official working languages of the United Nations, and those 2 languages were English and Russian. What audience they were attempting to speak to, I thought was rather clear.
Sorry, so I mean, there's so many questions. I want to bring Senator Musadik Malik into the conversation, but last point, because in a sense, you've gotten through maybe half or a quarter of your book so far. Kind of the pivot point then in the book is what happens, in February 2022. A lot happened here in Pakistan, and you talk about that. Chapter 17 in the book, guys, is this really interesting analysis of the energy crisis that followed the vote of no confidence. So Max doesn't delve too much into the politics around, former Prime Minister Imran Khan, or the coming in of former Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif and that transition. And maybe Senator Saab can speak a little bit about that. But I thought what was really interesting in that part of the book, Max, is this other passage that I just wanted to share with the audience, um, which, which again I think captures something really important for Pakistani audiences, and that is this paragraph. I can't cite the exact page, but it says Putin's strategy was misguided. So now this is a retrospective after February 24th, when Putin has attacked Ukraine, and things are now maybe 7, 8 months into that. Things are now kind of stuck. They're not shaping out the way Putin had imagined. They're certainly not going the way the West would have liked them to go. But Max's paragraph here is, I think, quite important. He says Putin's strategy was misguided. China and Russia could not become the basis for a new international monetary alliance because they both run major capital surpluses and operate capital controls, meaning they lack the ability to export their savings to one another. If trust were as deep as Moscow claims it to be, it would export all of its capital to China. This would make it even more dependent on Beijing while failing to alleviate the fact that China still needs a market to export its own excess savings. You can go on. There's parts like this in the book. This, again, I think captures, whether we like it or not, but a very harsh and stark reality about this international economic order that you were describing. Talk a little bit more about that, and then I'll come to you,
Sure.
Senator.
So, the point with Pakistan that I make in that chapter is, of course, the major cancellation of gas contracts that we saw beginning in the end of 2021, but really escalating in 2022. And what essentially happened was that a bunch of international commodities companies, Gunvor and one called Eni in particular, which had agreed to provide Pakistan with natural gas, used excuses in their contracts. I would term them that. They, of course, would defend it and say that it was allowed. But they used sort of excuses to cancel their gas deliveries to Pakistan, which had been set at long-term prices years before, to take advantage of the spike in prices that occurred from Russia's disruption of its own gas supplies to the West. So they were able to sell gas, for example, that originally was supposed to go to Pakistan to European countries for between 3 and 6 times the price. They were said, we're willing to take the risk. Pakistan will sue us. There is international arbitration going on over this right now. But that international arbitration and those structures are, of course, dominated in the West, right? They're based in London, Paris, Stockholm primarily. They're under rules set in part by the World Bank. So this is why I think it speaks to the importance of a country's positioning in that order when it comes to disputes like that. Russia has really escalated its attempts to build an alternate order. We see that with the so-called BRIC structures. Just on the 1st of January, they welcomed in the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. They want to expand to other countries. But for me, the real geopolitical power of the United States comes from that role of the dollar. And I often make this point to Western audiences. I say, look, the US could decrease its military spending by 80%. Somebody like me might actually like to see that. And I don't think it would impact the US's geopolitical power very significantly. But if the US dollar fell by 80% in terms of its role in international usage, the US's geopolitical power would be greatly, greatly diminished. And so for that structure and that excerpt there, what really matters is the importance of the unity between the West, Europe, and the United States in particular for maintaining this structure going forward, because they are the 2 largest stable deficit markets in the world. So the BRICS countries, let's say Brazil, Russia, India, China, they all earn more money than exporting than they do buy in imports, right? So they essentially have a pile of money sitting there that they need to go and find somewhere to put to use and to invest. As we know, whether it be Saudi royalty or it be Chinese relatives of government officials, they like to buy very nice hotels in London or bonds in the United States or property in the south of France. This is literally a result of that structural order. They see it as safe, certainly much safer than investing at home where they may have capital controls or investing in other emerging markets. So that's what I see as the real limitation to Russia and China's attempts to overthrow this US order. China has, I think, much longer term strategy for it. That is a real, risk. That is why the West is so concerned about the Belt and Road and others. But I think also, and then that's primarily for Western audiences, this is why the economic relationship between Europe and the United States is so much more important than the actual defense relationship, right? Even if every European country spends 2% of GDP on defense as it is recommended under NATO, that's not actually going to move the needle given how much money the US spends on it. And focusing on that economic relationship there is very important. But for a country like Pakistan and developing markets all around the world, understanding this order, how positions are in it and relations are in it, I think is hugely important for ensuring and trying to mitigate against the costs from it in the future. And I certainly hope and will be arguing as that arbitration process proceeds between the energy companies in Pakistan that they did do wrong by Pakistan and that they should have to pay compensation. However, the only way for them to pay compensation and to ensure that that is done is through the international economic order as it exists now.
So brilliant, Max. Really fantastic. I think that was a really amazing summary of the book and of some really important ideas. And you can tell from the audience's response that a lot of this really reverberates and resonates with people. Senator Saab, you were in the, many people would say privileged, but friends of yours would say in the unenviable position of suddenly in March, April 2022, having to contend with a set of circumstances that I know that many people in your political affiliation would blame the previous regime for, uh, and and I'm happy for you to, of course, express yourself. It's a free forum, but I would love for you to focus more of your energy on this this formulation, this group, this institutionalized. Sort of thuggery, I think, that companies like E&I and others enacted on Pakistan in essentially March, April, May, June, July, and you were trying to basically deal with the compounded impacts of that. There were other things that contributed to it, like the petrol subsidy, which I've written and spoken about myself. But a lot of this was imposed not by the IMF or the World Bank, I would argue, and not by the US government or even by the Russians or the Ukrainians. This was imposed in part by, I mentioned this to Max earlier, by the people that Javier Blas and Jack Farchi have written about in The World for Sale. It's the commodities traders and the companies that have emerged from that milieu that basically are also helping to set the rules of the international economic order that Maximilian has written about. I guess my long-winded question to you is, if China and Russia are having trouble negotiating and managing this galaxy of very important institutions and rules of the game, what chance does Pakistan have? And should we just maybe just sit down and just let all of this wash over us and let these companies do whatever they want to the people of Pakistan, as they did in the summer in particular of 2022?
Thank you very much. Does it work? So I think, first of all, my personal viewpoint is that when you take the responsibility, you can be critical and you can always talk about what the previous governments have done. But once you take the responsibility and you take the job, it's for you to keep it. So once we accepted the responsibility, it was our responsibility squarely, irrespective of what the previous governments had done. We had accepted, we looked at the way the game was structured. We accepted that responsibility. So I'm willing to talk about, and more inclined to talk about, what our responsibilities were and what we were able to do, rather than talk about what the previous government had done. I would say, in terms of, because we're talking about Russia, that Pakistan had no deal with Russia whatsoever. And all of what was being said that Pakistan was about to sign or Pakistan was going to get a discounted crude from Russia was completely bogus. There was no record of that, not even in the way of minutes. But that's about where I would stop. The first recognition that came about, may I take yours? The first recognition that came about once I took this job was very close to what you're saying. There's no such thing as global fabric. We were made to believe that world is one big global village, and we are all interwoven into a global fabric, and we affect practically each other. And therefore, Pakistan should go green. And therefore, Pakistan should not explore the reserves of coal that it has. And therefore, Pakistan should listen to everything that the West is saying. Are we kind of, in our naivete perhaps, or because we did not have a lot of degrees of freedom, believed in that? But as soon as the geopolitical anchor changed, and by that I mean the Russian and Ukraine war, the world changed. I mean, the prices, one cargo of LNG, which was worth 30 or $35 million, became 160. I mean, Abu Dhabi sold one cargo for $165 million. So $30 million gas became $160 million gas. We looked at the world and we said, well, you just told us yesterday we were interwoven into we're a global village and we're interwoven. What about us? And they looked at us with cold eyes and said, what about you? Go figure out. Go figure out. But what about the global village? I said, what global village? And then what do you find? You find that Germany opens up all of its coal mines. And Germany starts to produce electricity through coal. And I said, well, our coal was black. What about the German coal? Is the German coal purple with yellow polka dots? What's going on here? What color is the German coal? And the world was like, hey, talk to the hand because the face ain't talking. And I said, this privilege only my daughter has. Talk to the hand because the face ain't talking. This is only what my daughter can say, not you guys. So we did the best that we could for our own country. But the first recognition was that there's no such thing as one global fabric or one global village. There's geopolitics, there's geopolitical order, and in that geopolitical order, economy is weaponized. Economic order weaponizes the flashpoints. Now, flashpoints. I mean, you mentioned Palestine. You also mentioned Palestine. I'm very grateful that you called it genocide. Thank you very much. Because when you say it, it becomes more credible all of a sudden. When we say it, it becomes completely polarized. So I'm happy that not only us, but you are also calling it a genocide. You're calling it what it is. But the flashpoint, whether it is at the individual level, comes about because of the economic order that was imposed on Gaza and the West Bank. The flashpoint came about because of the economic constraints that were created and the impossibility of living that was imposed on the Palestinians. The exact same thing happens geopolitically amongst countries. The economic order precedes the flashpoint. So the economic order and the economic impositions that were made, whether by Russia on the West or the West on Russia, they preceded the flashpoint. And why am I bringing it? My job is to talk more about Pakistan. His job is global. His job is to provoke both of us, which he's great at doing. My job is to talk about Pakistan. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this, I'm going to give you an example, and then I'm not going to talk a whole lot about the flashpoints and about the economic weaponization. Right now, Europe has come up with new policies. And according to these new policies, they're going to be carbon audits. And with these carbon audits and carbon tracking, Pakistan would not be able to export anything to Europe over a period of time. The first generation of impositions are going to come in 2 years. Pakistan doesn't have the capability of doing the carbon audits, which means what? All of a sudden, the economic weapon would be used. It would be used as an economic barrier, as an entry barrier, as a trade barrier. And Pakistan would be left out in the cold, exactly in the same way in which Pakistan was left out in the cold when the prices of LNG went from $35 million, $30 million to $165 million. We'll be caught cold. We'll be looking at the world like this. What did you just do to us? And then if there is subsequent any flashpoints, everyone would forget about what preceded the flashpoints. So I'm not saying there will be any flashpoints. I'm giving you examples just the way I gave you the Palestinian example. I'm giving you an example of this can create tensions, and tensions can go haywire, and haywire political situations can lead to flashpoints. And at that point in time, the only things that comes under discussion is the flashpoint. And then we write a history and a viewpoint retrospectively in which the powerful prevails and the powerless loses the argument. For example, one last example with your permission. Right now, there are about 5 treaties between Europe, United States, and India. I mean, we have a situation with India, it's there. They have 5 treaties. They have information sharing treaties. These are all defense treaties. They have information sharing treaties in which Pakistan is excluded. Not only India is included, but Pakistan is excluded. There are logistics treaties in which Pakistan is excluded and India is included. So there are whole sorts of combined, there are 5 different treaties, particularly the information sharing and logistics support treaties are mission critical. And those treaties are in place. They are in place. India is included and Pakistan is excluded. Now, this is what happens 10 years before the flash or 20 years before the flashpoint. And those things that happened 15, 20 years before the flashpoint have already taken place, which appears to me on the surface that people are, or the geopolitics is already taking a position. I've given you one example of economic imposition. I've given you one example of defense treaties. Now, as a consequence of all of these, when basically we proceed, some flashpoint takes place, what would happen? Most of our exports, our economic order is informed by the United States and by the European Union, and not by Russia or by China. But all of the treaties that I have laid in front of you, including the economic as well as defense, are very clearly showing you where the pivot is, where it's heading, what is happening. And all of a sudden, this is going to go on. And unless the nature of Pakistani economy, the nature of Pakistani exports, the nature of Pakistani foreign policy is informed by these realities, and the shifts are stark and visible to the people of Pakistan in the way of where the world is going to be, what is going to be the position of Pakistan in that future world, and therefore, what kind of trade policy do we need to have right now? What kind of export policy? Who are going to be our partners in exports, in technology, diffusion of technology? Look at just the technology treaties that are taking place between our neighboring countries and us, and whether we included or excluded from this. You look at all of this, and then you do a comparison with Pakistan's foreign policy and Pakistan's trade and industrial policy, and you find it completely out of balance. Completely, I would say, out of balance. And if this balance is not restored, both in terms of geopolitics, in terms of healing and improving our relationships, and not making Twitter kind of foreign policies, or making foreign policies on Twitter, or using language which goes deep in terms of international relationships. You have to be prudent. You have to watch out for the interests of the people of Pakistan, for our future generations. And in order for us to do that, we have to know these realities. We need to take a position, and we need to have our trade policies. We need to have our economic policies. We need to have diffusion of innovation or technology policies, and foreign policies, defense policies, all integrated and woven into what would benefit the people of Pakistan, and be a fair citizen in this order, or whatever this is. This would be my opening remarks to your
Fantastic. Thank you, Senator Saab. Matt?
I have very few disagreements there. I think, for me, to say to the sponsors of our talk today and others, I am very adamant that it is not only not in the interests of a country like Pakistan to be misled that there's some kind of rules-based order or village, but that it's also not in the interests of the European Union or the United States to pretend like the economic issues aren't the foremost ones for them and the ones that are going to be determining policy. If you aren't honest with your partners and allies and even opponents, then you don't get very far. And I think, one last example that, just because there are a number of overlaps, including in regional foreign policy here, but that to hammer this issue home is last year there was another horrible ethnic cleansing. 100,000 ethnic Armenians were expelled from the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh, which was disputed following the partition of the Soviet Union. Armenia is a majority, overwhelmingly Christian country that see themselves as very European. Azerbaijan is of course, a majority Islamic country, but is a gas exporter, and including for the European Union was seen as a way that they could get more gas to replace that Russian gas. Ursula von der Leyen went there in 2022 to sign an agreement as conflict was already escalating between Armenia and Azerbaijan. What did the European Union do about this ethnic cleansing of 100,000 people and the unilateral solving of this conflict by the Azeri military and retaking all that territory? Nothing. Not a single sanction, not anything. There were some angry statements. And, I think that really speaks to the fact, what is the difference between the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, in which a kleptocratic, asset-rich state invades and goes to war with its neighbor over a territorial dispute? Between that and Russia and Ukraine, the only difference I see is that it was on the wrong side of the Black Sea. So Europeans feel that Ukrainians, because they're close and they're on the north side of the Black Sea, that's our problem. Armenians, even if they see themselves as Europeans, whatever, wrong side of the Black Sea, too close to the Middle East, not their problem. But realistically, the difference in what changed the incredibly different approaches, the United States didn't impose any sanctions on Azerbaijan either, was the economic importance of the country.
If I may.
Please.
I mean, there's also not a whole lot difference in what has gone on in Kashmir.
Yeah.
So I'm very glad that you mentioned one, but I would like to highlight the other. Do you think it's a sheer accident that right around when all of this, global kind of anchors are shifting, the Indian Supreme Court passes that judgment that all of those UN resolutions can go to hell, and Kashmir is the occupied Kashmir is an accident. Do you think it's just an accident? It wasn't an accident. It was an opportune political time which was exploited. So just the way the world stays silent at these other issues, and the world is silent right now about the Palestinians, exactly in the same way the world is silent. I haven't heard a squeak about first the Indian annexation. What about the United Nations? Where's United Nations today? Where are all of those resolutions? So there is, I agree with you, no rule-based anything. It is about, it's dog-eat-dog jungle out there. Whoever you can eat, you just go for it. And if you can get away with it, you get away with it. And you then build up all the arguments retrospectively. You tell your story after winning. And if you lose, you have no story. And that's basically the nature of realpolitik right now. That's where we are heading. And then when you end up with flashpoints, and particularly dangerous flashpoints, then everyone wakes up and it says, oh, let me tell you about it. What are you going to tell about it? I've just given you evidence of all of what happens 10 years, 15 years preceding the flashpoint. It is already happening. It's happening in every single place where you see the flashpoint, whether it be at the community level or it be at the country level. This, whatever you're calling the economic weaponization, it precedes the flash. And I am showing you, and there's one piece of evidence after another where this economic order or economic weaponization is taking place. And I'm in complete agreement with you. You call it the no rule-based kind of order. I call it not interwoven into anything. There's no such thing as global village. It's a dog-eat-dog world out there, and you have to be on your own, and you have to watch out for two things. You have to watch out for your own children, because that's your responsibility. But you also have to watch out for other children of the world, because they're no different than your own children. They bleed too. So you have to be responsible, you have to be careful, and you have to be prudent. And all of your policies have to be grounded in that.
So I want to pick up that theme, Senator Saab, and maybe Max, again, to ask you, for people that'll be listening to this, hopefully everyone here and others, many people are listening. One thing that somebody might conclude from this or derive from this conversation is, well, if it's a dog-eat-dog world and somebody as smart and as dedicated to the country as Musadik is saying that, then I guess we got to become dogs, right? Like we got to be a big dog. And to my mind, there's a session on this tomorrow about populism, but the obvious immediate implication, if you're interested in either global or local liberal orders, is that there is no room in a dog-eat-dog world for hey, let's find a way to cooperate multilaterally and play by the rules, because the people that play by the rules, or the ones that are forced to play by the rules, are at the bottom of the pyramid, and they're going to starve, and they're going to get burnt out by climate change. So in terms of your own expertise and your research and everything, how are you finding how this game being played out is being received in capitals like Islamabad, So Abuja might be another one. Of course, Riyadh and the GCC countries, but other countries as well. How are countries reacting to these lessons, which I don't think are unique to Pakistan, but where Pakistan really is a poster child for vulnerability?
I think it's pretty obvious to everybody, whether they are in Abuja or Montevideo or in Washington, D.C., that the world is going through a huge amount of change in the structure that it exists now. My view personally is that China actually quite likes the international economic order. Unlike Russia, which wants to destroy it, China just wants to replace the US as the core node. I think they have a 20 or 30-year strategy there, but certainly I come across as much less of a China hawk, so to speak, in Western audiences than I think that the standard level is now. That being said, the reality is that that hawkish position, even in Brussels, is dominating. And so we are going to see more conflict around the structure of this international economic order between the two and the United States as it looks to what powers it still has, as it loses friends and allies, as it's a shrinking share of the global economy. It still, however, controls the rules, right? And to use the dog example, I have a very large dog back home in London. And he goes and plays in the park with his friends. But there's a very small dog who barks a lot. And he always hangs out with that dog because that's the dog who determines where everybody else runs. So it's not always just about the size. And I think that is, if you're speaking from an American perspective, the US's advantage. If you're seeing it from, a third country, it's perhaps unfair position is that it still does have a lot more power in setting those rules. And while China is rising, it will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. I think the biggest threats to the United States come from within, and there are very active political trends there. I won't get into U.S. politics too much, but the election season starts on Monday, so that'll be fun. That actively misunderstand these issues and want to sort of pull back the U.S.'s role. But I expect that even if there is another Trump presidency, that the method in which the U.S. uses and in some cases abuses these powers will change. Trump will not care about sanctions on Russia, but he may do a lot more to support Israel. He will probably do a lot more on China. So, for me, when speaking to the smaller and medium-sized dogs, it really is much more, rather than just about identifying which are the biggest dogs, because the biggest dogs don't always necessarily fight, but about how the rules are set and why, and understanding whether it be those structural issues around the deficit that we spoke about. That's, I think, the lesson for the West, and understanding that the importance of the U.S.-European relationship is far more economic than it is security. Or it be speaking to audiences such as the one here and saying, look, there are going to be tons of other Westerners who come to you and lie and say that it is based in the rules and the like, or in this global fabric, and that you, whether it be as students, as diplomats, as academics, as researchers, the better you understand the rules of the game as they're played, even if you don't like those rules, and would agree with me that they should probably be changed in some ways, but you have to know what they are to be able to do that.
I have two questions, one for Senator Saab, one for you, Max, and then I want to go to the audience. And we're also short on time, partly because we started late and we still do want to finish on time. Senator Saab, you gave a really, I think, lucid sort of exegesis, really, of what needs to be done. But a lot of us look at you as not somebody who's there to tell us what's wrong and what needs to be done, but to actually do it. It's widely anticipated that, inshallah, as your friend, I don't know if it's good for the country, but as your friend, we anticipate that you'll be back in government soon. If you are, and you know what the threats are, you know that India is the Russia to Pakistan's Ukraine, and you know that unlike Ukraine, the Americans and the UK and the West, indeed, nobody's going to rush to Pakistan's defense. In a reasonably short sort of synthesis, what are the things that need to happen this year? And I'm deliberately asking this because it's being recorded, and when you're minister, we're going to come to you and ask you what you're doing about that.
Well, I'll start where you finished. and then I'll try to answer your questions. My apologies, I got confused and I thought the program was to start at 3:30. My apologies, it was my fault, but I was late by 7 minutes, so I'm willing to speak less by 7 minutes if you don't.
Or I think the audience would be happy to stay longer, and we'll test
I-
Yaqub Bangash's patience.
I'm good either way, but I wanted to apologize because I got confused. I thought it was on every half an hour. So one thing that you said is very interesting, and you said this small dog running around just barking, making a lot of noise, and the big dog just walking around and pushing and defining. So I think a lot of countries that are screaming foul are these small dogs. And I think, therefore, the most important thing is to fortify. It is not someone else's responsibility to make Pakistan. Using Pakistan, I laid out my bias and I said, I shall speak from Pakistani perspective. It's not someone else's responsibility to make Pakistan strong. So I think the single most important thing for us is to make Pakistan strong. Depolarize as we are, and think about rationally moving forward and strengthening Pakistan, both in terms of its foreign policy and in terms of its economic policy. As you've already seen, they're intertwined and they're actually the same. And one precedes the other. And if economic order precedes the other political order, as we've seen, weaponizing economy is the first order of business before you go for the flashpoint, where the dogs kind of just look eye to eye and say, I'm going to take you on. So I'm saying before that flashpoint, before that time comes, it's very important for us to strengthen Pakistan and fortify Pakistan. That would be the first order of business, I think. The second thing that I would say is that perhaps we should not play the dog game. I think the difference between just a politician and a statesperson in terms of nations as well. I mean, you can do the same at the international theater rather than just thinking about politicians. Is that rather than doing just the politics, which you end up doing anyway and always, you also do the statesmanship. And rather than playing the game and trying to win the game, you change the game. You change the rules by which the game is getting played. And in order for you that you will have to basically create a whole new order of relationships, because by yourself you wouldn't be able to do that. So you will have to form new alliances, new relationships, new orders, which kind of jointly may walk rather than one kind of small dog running around making a lot of noise. So one, I would say, strengthen the dog. Two, I would say, don't play the dog game. Change the rules of the game. Try to change the rules of the game by creating a whole new web of alliances and repositioning yourself in this international order. That's the second order of things. The third question that you specifically asked, I mean, I'd give you an example. I mean, look at South Africa. Look at what Nelson Mandela did. Look at how he changed the rules of the game. He didn't play the game. He elected not to play the game. He chose not to play the game. I mean, it made no sense for him at that point in time not to play the game after what had happened. And he chose not to play the game. And look at the position that South Africa has just taken, which is just the aftermath of the position that it took about 20 years ago in the United Nations, just about 5, 7, 6 days ago. What is this? What's going on here? What is this lingering shadow of what that one man did, which has created new positions for South Africa, whether it be on Israel or whoever else? So what I'm trying to say is that you can also reposition. I'm not saying what position it would be, but I'm saying you don't have to play the game by the same rules. You can change the rules of the game as well. And this is the difference at the personal level as a politician and a statesperson, and in the global theater between a country playing realpolitik, and creating a whole new order. So these are the positions, these are the choices that Pakistan has. As far as I am concerned, in terms of moving forward, I mean, I would say we were 1 year, E&I bailed on us, and what was the other company you named?
E&I?
And
Vittel.
No, it wasn't Vittel. It was the other trading company. Anyway, they bailed on us. No, anyway, forget about it. They bailed on us, and what did we do? We went and did a deal with Azerbaijan to get one distressed cargo every month. with 100% discretion in our hand to reject every single deal that they put in front of us. So they were going to put one distressed cargo in front of us every month, and we had a choice to bail on all 12 cargoes without any implication, economic implication, and they would still be bound to continue to put that one cargo in front of us.
Who
This was-
negotiated that for
I mean,
Pakistan?
We did, I did.
I know. I
I-
want you to tell everybody. It's okay to show off
Well,
once in a while.
No, but that's not material. Material is what can be done. I mean, rather than saying, in 7 years we'll figure out what happens to the litigation, we needed it in that particular year. We went and cut that deal out in that one particular year. We were basically couldn't afford oil. We were having gasoline price problem. What did we do? We cut a deal with Russia. Did anyone squirm? Did you see the United States opposing the deal?
Janet Yellen said it was a good
No,
thing.
it was a good deal,
Yeah,
right?
She said so.
And he also, White House came out and said, we have no problems with Pakistan making a deal with Russia. How did we bring that about? How did we bring it about? I mean, they have objections to everything. Your book gives so many examples of how US would descend upon anyone who was trying to do that. How did we become an exception? Why did Europe not kind of scream foul?
Well, we don't know.
It's
So you have to
because-
tell us. Yeah.
It's because we were transparent in our dealings. We changed the rules of the game. We didn't go the smuggling way. Many of the neighborhood countries are going the smuggling way. They're in the black market. They're getting cargoes from the black market. We elected not to do that because I think countries need to have integrity. Countries are not a bunch of smugglers. So we elected not to do border smuggling. We elected not to go and deal with the front companies. And we did a G2G deal. We kept everyone on board, the United States included, the European Union included. We went and spoke with them. We were equally transparent with the Russians. We did not basically raise the new order, economic order that they were, but we made it visible to everyone that we have to cut a deal without naming the new economic order within the economic order, complying with every single week, complied. In 4 to 5 months, what did we do? We cut a deal with them from start to finish, transparently, keeping everyone on board. We created basically the logistics framework. There was no logistics relationship, route, or ships available for us to get the cargo from Russia to Pakistan. So we brought 100,000 ton cargo, which cannot land in Pakistan, to Oman. We took that 100,000 ton cargo and broke it into 2 small cargoes, which can land in Pakistan. We did it in the ocean. And we brought those 2 cargoes of 50,000 tons each to Pakistan. We couldn't get insurance because globally insurance was banned on Russia. We found another mechanism of getting insurance and reinsurance for the cargoes. The financial transactions were banned. So we were able to do all of this. And I'm not at liberty to disclose the terms of the deal, but the deal was fantastic for us. And there were so many discussions about black oil and we can process. We brought the cargoes, we tested them, we figured out what percentage of Russian crude could be mixed with the light Arab crude and in what proportions can we process. And we processed it and we sold it. And we got so much benefit from that deal that if we are able to scale it, and we wouldn't be able to scale it a whole lot. We import 8 million tons. We could go to anywhere from 500,000 ton to 1 million ton. That's the natural limit. But whatever benefit there is would go to the people of Pakistan. So whether it be Azerbaijan deal, whether it be the Russian crude deal, and we were in the middle of doing a comprehensive energy agreement with the regional countries, including TAPI, including IP, the Iran pipeline. We proceeded
Do you want to talk about
significantly.
Turkmenistan as well? Or?
Yeah. TAPI is Turkmenistan. We have a fantastic deal with Turkmenistan. We went to Europe and we said, we want this to be a new, I don't know, crescent is a bad word, right? Yeah, crescent is arch is a bad word.
Yeah.
So we can't use arch and crescent. But for the sake of European security, if we are able to get TAPI into Pakistan, we could put trains as large as Qatari trains in basically our port and be Pakistan as one of the largest exporters of Turkmenistan's LNG, Turkmenistan's gas. And this is something that the Turkmenistan agreed to. Even the Afghans were agreeing to it. We basically are extremely motivated. We want European investment for that. We want Chinese investment for that. We want Gwadar to be the hub of energy where the LNG trains are put, and they basically lead into European energy security as much as Pakistan's energy security. So we were trying to interweave Europe's security with Pakistan's security, with Turkmenistan's sales, with stability in Afghanistan. And this is what I call changing the rules of the game. And we were
Fantastic.
able to do that.
Fantastic, Musadik. I think a round of applause for you, but also a promise that some of this stuff, which is a brilliant vision and one that I entirely am sort of aligned with, and I know there's people in the audience that have written about this and thought about this, so there's a lot of excitement about this. We'll all be holding you and your colleagues in cabinet to account in the coming months.
I've not been invited.
Max, one thing that we missed out on, but it's not every day that we have somebody who has the kind of handle on issues that you do. Now let's zoom out. We've talked a lot about Pakistan and what happened 2022 and 2014 and 2002. Maybe just close out by explaining how it is that Russia and Russian culture, Russian strategic culture, bounces back so quickly and goes for the jugular in terms of seeking dominance. And I don't think, I mean, you've described it as Eurasian dominance, that Putin is driven, but some would argue, being a Westophile, perhaps I would argue that it's never really about Eurasia, and it is global. And it seems like it's global. It was global in the 50s and 60s and 70s. It seems like that's reemerging. What is it about Russia that causes this? Because there are other countries that are doing well that don't behave in the way Russia does.
Certainly, I wouldn't say it's something innate in the Russian people. The Russian people not only drove the Bolshevik Revolution, changed the world, but then collapsed the Soviet Union, played the key role there, changed the world again. I really think it has far more to do with the governance structure and the people Putin keeps around him. Who, Putin is known as this spy. He was in the KGB, did have a lot of business experience in the 90s, and that was actually what got him promoted into the Kremlin, his ability to manage the relationship between private industry and government. But, I think he and the sort of class of individuals around him really see Russia's rightful place as one of the great powers in the world, and is very much aggrieved by that. And that's why, as I said earlier, there's this difference in approach between China and Russia, which is, I think the Putin regime recognizes that it is not going to be one of two great powers again in the way the Soviet Union was, but that its sort of best hope is to knock everybody else down a peg and to have a much more chaotic I wouldn't even call it an order at that point, but a much more, Russia really wants the dog-eat-dog system because they are a big dog. So exactly what the senator was cautioning against is exactly what Russia sees as its advantage. And, 2 quick points just before hopefully we can get a question in on that. I think the South Africa example is a particularly good one because it also shows how working together can change things, and that, it was the African countries that really came together when Britain was declining as a global power to put pressure on Margaret Thatcher and other British leaders in the past in the 80s to say, listen, if you want us to stay part of the Commonwealth and go part with these institutional structures that are legacies of Britain formerly having a great power, you have to actually not include South Africa and then ultimately sanction them and the like. And I do think there is some horse trading hopefully to be done there in the future where the so-called global South, which is, the term the West likes to use about the rest, can go and say, hey, if you want us to be on board with X, Y, and Z against Russia, then we expect at least A and B of A, B, and C with regards to, other issues. I wish, all governments the best of luck in doing that. And that's why I think it's, so important to recognize it as this non-rules based order, but an economic one.
Max, I think so. We are way over time, but there are questions, and this is a big crowd for this thing. So, congrats to you and to the senator. We're going to only take 3 questions, and we're going to only take questions, and they're going to be short so that we can let them speak a bit more. and I'm gonna just use this privilege to just go a bit further over time.
Take all three at once.
We're gonna take all three at once. We're gonna start right at the top because nobody ever sees people way in the back. So we're gonna start with that young man, then we'll come to this young man, and then are there any sisters in and then we'll come to madam over here. So start with your question, sir. Yeah, you. Yeah, right.
My question is just from Max that he said it's all about the Russia, why Russia attacked Ukraine. So it is very shiny word that in 1990s we assured Russia that NATO won't expand to the Eastern Europe. So I think it's all the Western and NATO fault. It's not Russia. Russia is doing something in preemptive strike, and Russia is doing something for its territorial integrity and sovereignty. And if it weren't, if NATO wasn't stopping Ukraine, so it would, the blood would be.
Thank you.
Got it.
I'll
We got
respond
the
to that.
question. Excellent. No. There's only one question. We don't have time, brother. Madam, we'll come to you next. Is there a mic? You can use mine if you like.
Thank you. I have two questions, one from Musadik Saab, the other from Max. Okay. Musadik Saab, that you have glorified a lot about your fantastic deals and everything. Have you thought about the internal policy dynamics, energy security with respect to Pakistan, how we shifted from the and how things has been mismanaged in terms of hurdle, and what about the energy mix? There is no internal policy, and there is a great mismanagement and misgovernance in respect to energy security.
Max, my question is from you. When will EU realize that it's time to break the shackles of slavery and have their foreign policy come to them from Washington, D.C., even when it economically hurts them? Why do you guys need to buy Russian oil from India? You know what I'm talking about, right? Why do you have to do this? Because an Indian prime minister said that you can choose your friends, but you cannot choose your neighbors. Russia is your neighbor, United States is not. So why have this whole conflict with Russia, which is driven by United States, and a future conflict with India, because
Yeah, got
you
it.
know, please.
Excellent question. I'll take the mic back. I'll beg your forgiveness just because I want to stick to
I'll answer after. If I can start off with the first and last questions, then. On the first question, there's a very good book that came out 2 years ago called Not 1 Inch Further, I believe, by Mary-Louise Sarraute, about the history of that exact debate, whether the United States or NATO as a whole, which because the United States can't promise it alone, never agreed that it wouldn't expand to the east. It was mentioned as a proposal, but it was never formally agreed. That being said, that Russia believes it to be true is a reality that we have to accept. Ukraine was no closer to joining NATO in 2022 than it was in 2014 or than it was in 2008. And if you look at the amount of times that Putin has actually mentioned NATO in connection with Ukraine since invading in February, I counted it a few months ago, so this has probably changed, but it was 4 times. The amount of times that he'd complained about the dollar system was over 20 times. Putin used the NATO thing as an excuse to build public support for his war, but just as we've seen, he doesn't care about Sweden and Finland joining. It is not actually what motivated Putin to intervene in any way. On the question with regards to the European interest and whether it shouldn't be so aligned with the United States, I admit my bias in that I'm half American and half European. What I would say is I would disagree, unsurprisingly, because I do believe that if Europe had to do its own security guarantees and didn't have the US as sort of the dominant security power there, not only would we see a lot more common wars in Europe between the Russia and the so-called East Bloc and Central and Western Europe, but also within Europe itself. And there are many in Europe who chafe at the dominance of the US in that relationship. And I do think Europe should be smarter about saying, hey, our euro market can be an actual competitor to your dollar market. We can borrow too. The problem is the Europeans can't agree amongst themselves to do that because they can't agree mutual debt. They did a little bit in the Corona pandemic, but they really need a European debt market for the euro to ever be a global challenger to the dollar in the same way that it is now. And they fight each other too much to get there. So in my view, while there are many things I would like about it, we already see that fighting now. How much worse would that be if there wasn't that US Big Brother relationship? I worry a lot. So I think it's a good ideal and something Europe should keep in mind, but a quick break would be very dangerous.
Excellent. Excellent responses. Great question and beautifully framed. The last word goes to the second most handsome politician in Pakistan. Dr.
So, first, just a comment. I think a big problem is because Europe, in terms of just following up on what you said, is an economic bloc and not a political bloc. If Europe was a political bloc, it would be a lot more powerful and forceful than it is. But it isn't a political bloc. It's an economic bloc. And the alliances, all of them, are economic alliances and very few real political alliances. And therefore, this kind of desegregation of the economy and politics, which is what you proposed, is for real, not there, shouldn't be there, because nothing works like that. Europe is working against that framework. Europe thinks that economic integration is actually a proxy political integration, and therefore it would be a lot more powerful. It could be, but it isn't, because the political integration is not there. So that's just a comment. Madam, you've asked a very difficult question, and I find it very difficult to answer your question. If I try to answer, it becomes almost like I'm giving you a defensive position. But since when I was thinking how not to be defensive about it and answer your question, and I found very limited degrees of freedom. So I'd start with a defensive. First, I recognize your question, that it's a very important one. There's been a lot of flaws in the energy policy and they need to be fixed. Second, it is not that we were only working on treaties, the defensive part. We basically created, for the first time in as many years as we've discovered the gas, for the first time in the history of Pakistan, within 18 months, we created two separate tariffs, one for the rich and one for the poor. We overcharged the rich of Pakistan and we subsidized the poor. And while we were doing that, we cleared the market, which basically means the contribution to the circular debt from our own wellhead gas, the gas that we produce, came to zero. It was 1,700 billion rupees of circular debt, which was growing at 17 to 20% per year. We brought the circular debt contribution from our wellheads to zero. And we created a framework to make the overall circular debt also, including LNG, to zero. And that plan was handed over to the caretaker government. And I understand that right now the circular debt contribution to the gas sector of Pakistan is zero. So we brought it to zero for our own wellheads, and we gave a plan to the caretakers to bring it to zero overall, and I believe it is zero overall. So the circular debt, which was sinking Pakistan economically, that circular debt has been brought to zero, while making sure that rich are overcharged and the poor people of Pakistan don't have 1 cent additional of tariff on them. This is basically what we did.
Can I just quickly add just a data point from the book, because it's just on the first page of that chapter 17 for the benefit of the audience as well. Pakistan started natural gas imports, LNG imports, in 2015. And within 3 years, 1/5 of Pakistan's entire energy spectrum was being provided by LNG, which is A, clean, and B, a very different kind of investment in terms. I mean, I can let Musadik speak more about that, but you're privy to those decisions back in 2015 as well.
And I'm also saying that even that is a misnomer. About 1/3 of Pakistan's gas that we don't even consider gas is given to 4 companies directly without even adding them into our mix. This is called the low BTU gas, which is given to the fertilizers, 4 companies, at a price which is less than Saudi Arabian price. Saudi Arabia sells its gas to its fertilizers for $2. To one of the companies, we sell it for 70 cents. And to the other 3, on average, we sell it for $1.34. So we must be richer than Saudi Arabia. That all has to change. This is what I am calling we have to restructure. Quickly again, madam, I just take less than 60 seconds. The second part is that we made sure that every single gas company, petroleum company in Pakistan has a subsidiary, and OGDC and PSO has already started the business, and OGDC has passed the board resolution and created a subsidiary which would only do the renewables at 3 cents or 4 cents. So in these 18 months, every single energy company is now promised and in terms of board resolution, written that it's going to make a transition from a petroleum and gas company to an energy company, which means renewable company. And PSO has already started that business. And PSO is way ahead of the game, and it would kick ass, I tell you. And it's a very good team. I'm very proud of the PSO team. So this is the second thing that we did. The third thing that we did was we put out 16 new blocks, which had not been done in a decade. 16 new blocks for bidding, so that new indigenous gas, offshore and offshore, can be included. And I, for one, was not terribly supportive of coal, but after seeing the geopolitics, I also think it's very important for us to get hydrogen, get green ammonia, and also to get coal, clean coal technology, carbon capture and all of that. So we're doing that. The last part that you said about hydro is because hydro means water-based. Hydro energy is the best energy, but the most expensive one. The capital investment is very high. It takes roughly $2.5 million, $2 million to $3 million per megawatt in the way of civil engineering work that needs to be done for hydro energy, in terms of our dams and civil works and so on and so forth. And it also takes about 6 to 10 years to build up a big hydro plant like we have Basha and we have Dasu. Our energy needs were urgent. We needed to give a solution to the people of Pakistan in 3 years. So the reason why we went for quick wins is because the most expensive form of energy is not having it. There was a dampening of about 2.5% of GDP. Our total growth comes to 5% and never more, and then collapses. So the impact of not having energy was about 2 to 2.5%. So we went for the gas-based energy. We shut down the furnace oil-based energy. We went for gas-based energy, nuclear energy, and some other energies because of that. But that portfolio needs to be fixed. Renewables need to be a very big part. Water needs to be a very big part for long term, but we need a lot of money for that, and we are walking in that direction. But your question is very well founded, and it needs a lot of correction.
There should be another. Well, this could have gone on for another 2 hours. A round of applause for all of you for staying through and listening and being a great audience. A round of applause for Senator Musadik Malik and for Maximilian Hess for writing a brilliant book and presenting his idea so powerfully. Thank you, everyone.